The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Today, a glimpse into our past, a story told with words and paintings in Journey from the Dawn, Life with the World's First Family. The story and illustrations were done by Kevin O'Farrell, a designer who's worked with a dizzying array of museums on a long and eclectic list of exhibits for adults and children. Journey from the Dawn is O'Farrell's first book. And let's begin by introducing the first family. Who were they?
Don Johansson, my co-author, found about 18 years ago the skeleton of a small woman in the Hadar area of Ethiopia. Right now it's a very desolate area, but we found in reconstructing the area that it was a lot more lush then than it is today. The year after finding Lucy, which he named after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The Beatles happened to be singing that song the night that he found Lucy, and she became the character. And it was a lot better than Australopithecus afarensis.
I agree.
A little shorter. And the following year they went back, because they had this great success the first year, and they found the remains of an entire family. And there were 12 individuals that they found, and they've, in various degrees of decomposition and so forth, bits and pieces that they've been putting together. But it ranged from children through adults. And what we've done, most of the anthropology books to date have been scientific pieces that kind of treat bones as bones. And we've been very concerned about creating the total environment for these characters. So instead of just bones, they become people of sorts. Now, I'm not saying that these people are humans. These are pre-humans, so they lived 3.5 million years ago. And if we think of cave people, the cave people are relatively recent, so they're Cro-Magnon man, and they're in the hundreds of thousands of years.
If we ran into this family on the street, would we recognize them as fellow humans? What did they look like?
They're short people, Randy Newman's heroes, and somewhat hairy. We assume that they'd be somewhat hairy. I did a lot of work in the reconstruction side. Their bodies are almost identical to ours. Their torso, kind of like mine, is a little on the long side, and their legs are a little on the short side. So it gives the impression that their arms are out of proportion and longer. Their heads are really different, though. The heads still look like a chimpanzee's. And so we have this interesting marriage. And what happened, they inherited characteristics from their primate ancestors. So they inherited this beautiful binocular vision system here, so that they could see with a parallax, a stereo vision, so they could determine depth perception very well. They could see how far away this is. They developed an opposable thumb from the primates, where the primate had to swing from branch to branch and had to hook on to this branch and hook on to that one. Well, these guys now use that opposable thumb to reach and grab things and pick them up. So married that with the depth perception that they got in their eyes, they can pick up an object, and if the bad guy is coming, they might throw it at him. And so we have that wonderful adaptation.
Physically, they looked a little different than we did, as you described. Is there any way at this state of knowing mentally, emotionally, how much like us they were?
The way that we did that for the book is to step a little further back and a little further forward. So we stepped a little further back into primate land and looked at Jane Goodall's research on chimpanzees and Diane Fossey's work with gorillas and so forth. And we know how they interrelate. And they have communications among themselves. There's dominance and subordinance games. And we've integrated a lot of that in here, even the language. So you'll see Lorcan, who is kind of the dominant male in the group, not necessarily the dominant character. I think that if you read the book, you'll see a certain dominance in a certain old lady who really has it together, and that's Iba. She's kind of the conduit to all the information in the past. But Lorcan might initiate a movement in the group by just hooting or barking. And you'll find that commonly in chimp groups and so forth. Body language is a huge thing. So we have body language. I'm always talking with my hands. I guess it's my New York background or something like that. But they did too. And all the facial expressions, you know. And we have one episode in the book where Kano, another character, another quite a dominant male, is looking to sit in Kano's seat, which is like Archie Bunker with Meathead, you know, saying, "You're sitting in my seat." But instead of getting into any physical confrontation, Lorcan just stares. And in gorilla land, a stare is the biggest threat you can ever give. None of those big showing of teeth and so forth has the impact of a closed-mouthed stare. So he's intense with the stare. And there are, like, we'll also demonstrate when finally a pressure point builds up, Lorcan does get into a mock charge. They're not really into violence in those days. Gorillas will charge, and they'll charge until you stop. If you stop there and stare at the gorilla will stop. If you run, the gorilla will chase you. And so it's kind of like the dogs, you know, they do the same kind of thing. And Kano responds by smiling, a broad-faced smile, that nervous smile. But actually, if you go downtown today, you'll see that in corporate offices. You'll see the boss staring and the next guy kind of smiling nervously and looking at him.
You used the word reconstructing, and you did have to really do some guesswork and some scientific work to do this book. You used a wonderful phrase to describe what you came up with, and you called it a soup of possibilities.
Yes. We looked at all the science that was available to us, and we know something about primitive man, and I don't know if I like that term, but people who live in remote areas. They're not so primitive, they're pretty advanced for where they live, like the people who live in the rainforest today, the Bushmen of Africa, the Aborigines of Australia. They live in harmony with nature, and they're very advanced actually in their own world. You know, they don't drive Mercedes and so forth, but they can move around and adapt better than anybody else to those environments. So we learned a lot from just knowing about them. Then we started looking again at our primate friends and learned a lot about them. Now we started putting it together with the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was Hadar. So we spoke to geologists, and they told us, in this area, Ethiopia today is arid, you know, we have all these problems in that area. There's a huge lake in this area at that time. There was a volcano and another triple-headed volcano. That volcano also gave birth to hot springs, geyser activity, sulfuric acid lakes, and so forth.
One of the
all
great
kinds
stories
of
in the
scary
book.
things, you know. And so, and then I put a little bit of my own childhood into it. And my own childhood, and actually I design all these children's museums, and I hang out with the kids sometimes when I do it. And looking at a plant like this, or looking at a reflection in the water, is intriguing. And when we started looking at the animals too in the area, the animals gave clues. We have one little episode where Lonig, he's just on the realm of what we'd call a teenager today. He's young for a teenager, but he's quite savvy. He's out there and he's looking over a stream, and he watches this one bird, and the bird puts one wing out over the water and looks into the shadow of that wing, and sees the fish swimming by in the shadow where the glare has prevented his father, Lorcan, and Lorcan's brother from catching a fish because they can't see the fish. So he watches that, and he then mimics the bird. And you'll find mimicry all through nature. So he goes over and he stares into the water in his own shadow. So in the shadow of his torso, while he's leaning like this, he sees the fish, and then he grabs the fish like that. And so all through it, we've got these little vignettes of learning from nature. There's another episode where the same guy, he has chased his young sister away from this nest of ostrich eggs, and he comes back because he's curious about them, but he hears this clacking sound when he gets there. What's that clacking sound? It's this Egyptian vulture there who's busily banging these ostrich eggs with rocks. And he's wondering what is going on. He sees this activity going on there, and then he realizes how to open that egg through the Egyptian vulture's efforts and so forth. And then we get into the big confrontations with the ostriches who are not too excited about him opening their eggs. You know.
What kind of perspective did doing this reconstruction and working on this book give you, not about our past, but about our future?
I think that what the book came out with is almost a spiritual kind of feeling, where these guys lived as a family, and the family was a strong unifying element that ensured their survival. The males have a tendency to look out there watching for the predators and so forth that are going to attack. The females have a tendency to look within, and they're protecting their children and so forth. And the kids are always interested in discovering things. And the key element was that they lived in concert with nature. They weren't in dominion of it. If a big rhino came by, they realized that who had the right of way, and they stepped aside and let the rhino go by. And we have a tendency in our society to think that we have the powers over nature. And we don't get the clues often, where the clues are very obvious sometimes. Like we have a little vignette in the very beginning of the book. Lucy's lying down. She's pregnant. She's staring up at the stars, and she feels vibrations. There's vibrations from within her, but then the Mother Earth is vibrating too. This volcano in the background is rumbling quietly, and as people around here might know, there's a bulge occurring. Tension in the herds. She observes the herd, so she gets clues from everything in nature. She checks the weather by just feeling the humidity on her face and so forth, so she knows that something's going to happen. There's a transition from a dry season to a rainy season going to happen. And just being opening up all of her pores and all of her senses to the world. Yeah.
Is this a book that you wrote with children in mind?
I think I wrote it with families in mind, myself and Don. The idea is, instead of saying children as one entity and parents as another entity, like I have a problem, where do they put it in a bookstore? I guess they could put it in the kids section, they could put it in anthropology, they could put it anywhere. They could put it as a coffee table book, art book. I like to think of it as a family book so that parents will read it with their children and share it with their children. And it's something that I got from museums. Like one of the museums I worked in was the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And they have the Steinhardt Aquarium there. Well, we put the labels for the fish tanks up top. And you got this big, glorious fish tank here. And the kids would come up, the families would come up on a Sunday afternoon, and all the kids would look at the fish. Wow, look at that fish. What's that, Daddy? Daddy wouldn't have a clue. So he'd look up at the label up here and says, oh, that's an archer fish. Oh, Daddy, you're such a smart dad. I really love you. And so what happens is you get this.
You're thinking of yourself there.
But you've got this nurturing effect that goes back and forth. And what happens, like in the story here, we'll have the kids discovering things because, like little Liban here, she's the little 4-year-old girl. She sees little things. So she goes and looks at the bugs. Sometimes it's a great joy. Sometimes it's scary because she doesn't always know what she's looking at. But I think that for parents, like I'm a kid who was raised in New York, and here to, people think, oh my God, it must have been dangerous then with the saber-tooth tigers and everybody chasing them around. But we had taxi cabs chasing us around and subways and things like that. And so I think we can apply a lot of the learning that we'd get from people like this, or people like the Hopis, or people like the Anasazis, or whoever, and learn a lot about the future.
Where did a kid who grew up in the Bronx learn to love nature so much?
It's like a tree grows in Brooklyn. When there's not enough around, each one becomes framed. So I remember I did the largest show of Ansel Adams' work ever once. And so Ansel and I were sitting there watching, looking at this big photograph that's one of his most famous photos. And he said, you know where that is? That's right above a baseball field. And all the people are down there playing baseball and stuff. And their whole field of vision is down here. I just happened to look up a little bit. And there's this beautiful mountainscape with the snow. It's like here, looking up at Mount Hood or Mount Rainier or something. You look up a little bit above the city, and you see this incredible panorama. And I was always intrigued by that. We had a vacant lot across the street from me, and it was magic. My parents came from Ireland. They were immigrants, they were farmers. And so they would take us to Staten Island in the summer, and we lived in a little bungalow at the beach, and I caught everything that there was to catch in the sea, and I went into the bushes on the other side and caught all the snakes and turtles and brought them home, and my mother said, oh God. But then she said, that's great. She let me keep them, and then I re-released them and so forth, and so it worked.
When you began designing for museums, you traveled all over everywhere and looked at various exhibits and museums. What sort of things did you see that inspired you, that gave you ideas for designs?
What really inspired me was not the museums, it was the places in between. What inspires me often is more the people who work in the museum, or the adventure of getting to the museum. Like I was asked to do a master plan for Jack London State Park, where Jack London lived. And I said, we should do something about a program to get the kids there. So before they ever get to this place, they get into his spirit, and his spirit was one of experience. So I often tell people I don't design exhibits, I try to design experiences. Something that will be thrown into a memory bank. It's like riding the roller coaster at Coney Island or something like that. Something that just rockets you into a particular feeling. And so the museums themselves, I found problems when things became objects, where they treated Africa or a giraffe or a pelican as an object. The next phase was to put it in context, to build a diorama where there's a frozen sense, and those were nice historical perspectives of a particular time. They were very valid in the 1920s and so forth. Now we've got all this media available to us, and so the next step was to add video and television to it. So then, now we show the pelican flying. Isn't that great? The next step is to show something that you can't see. So then we add microscopy and so forth, where we allow, if we can do it, we have an interactive laser disc system where we'll allow people to ask any question they ever wanted to know about a pelican.
Do you get to ask the pelican?
You can ask the pelican if you want to speak Pelicanese, but you get into, gee, how does the feathers work? How does these shock absorbers work? When he crashes into the water, this prevents him from impacting himself. And you keep on, I'd like people to think, if they could, radially, so that each moment triggers them off in a new direction, so that they're not going at something directly. Like, we were late coming to the studio today because the highway was jammed. Well, that was a great learning experience because I saw a lot of Seattle, because we went through all the side roads and so forth, and that becomes the great adventure. And I'm often saying, God, if people could only take the side roads more often. The side roads in all of life, though, not just going directly to a given topic, because there's always something to learn over here and over there. And you'll eventually get there, but you'll pull in all that other stuff.
When you did your travels, did you find any contrast between the places that you saw in other countries, the kinds of museums and exhibits that were put together, compared with the kinds of museums and exhibits in this country?
It's interesting. In Europe, the objectification is very important. There's a natural history museum in Ireland where I also live, and they have, it's every dead thing that ever lived is in that museum. So they got just stacks of dead things, piles of them, textures, and they're treated texturally. And that's offensive to me, because it's like paying the hunters to go out and blast every animal that there is and just bring in this frozen trophies. The next step is in the United States, the new direction in museums, and Canada's been doing it all along. I consider Canada to be the most advanced that I've seen in the world. But in the United States, they're trying to put things in context now. They're just trying. It's new. So they used to have African Hall, they used to have Bird Hall, and they used to have halls like that. People went in and they saw elephants in African Hall and they saw birds in Bird Hall. But in fact, those birds live in Africa. So the new technique is to put them in context like this book. So like this book is virtually, I'm giving people a bit of a museum to take home with them. Because we have stories of bugs, we have stories of birds, fish, reptiles, and everything all together. And so the idea of building like a rainforest, you'll find, an awful lot of the aquariums and the zoos and the natural history museums are building rainforests now. Why? Because they're like a reef, a coral reef that sticks above the waterline, and it's so rich in life forms. The statistics are unbelievable. And so what they do, you can tell the entire ecology story now through context.
In addition to context, it seemed to me that one of the big changes in museum is moving away from the sort of the pickling of art or natural history or whatever the subject of the museum is, and getting into it, being part of it, playing with it.
Mm-hmm. I was even asked to discuss methods of making art a little bit more accessible to people. In art museums, it's often, you have kind of a hyphenated audience, an audience that, I've studied art, so I know. Science is like that too. The word science comes from the verb to know, but some people say, I know, where they take it the whole way out and they just put the noun in front of it. And in this case, we are building eddying areas in some of these art museums now, areas between the artworks themselves, so the art can be seen in isolation and you can just sit one-on-one with the piece. But then if you want to find out the triangulation that was used in the Last Supper to draw attention to Christ in the middle of the table or something like that, you can analyze it geometrically in these eddying areas or the spaces between the galleries. And I think philosophically that's where I come from a lot too, is the idea of a plaza concept. The places between are very important. People places.
So that there's a flow and there's a real science to how people actually use the space, not only what they're seeing and involved with.
That nothing was done in isolation, that the art piece was a piece that had the church, or it had the Medici family, or the government, or you had technology working. Like Futurism was this wonderful period where you had nude descending a staircase and so forth, and the whole thing ended quickly. Why did it end? The next year, somebody developed a motion picture camera. They didn't need Futurism anymore.
There's such a diversity in the kinds of exhibits that you've put together. I mean, just a tremendous range of things. And surely, maybe you are, but it seems hard to think that you'd be an expert in all of those different areas. Mm-hmm. So how do you know how they should be displayed if you're not an expert in a school of art?
Expert. Like Don Johansson, my co-author here, he's the expert. He knows Lucy and her bones and so forth so well. It's amazing. I don't have to read the book. I can just have a chat with Don and I can learn enough from him. In a normal museum setting, we'll have a curator, and the curator might be an ichthyologist who knows all about fish, or a botanist who knows something else. What I'm trying to do more of now is to get them all together. So I get a botanist, and I'll get the ichthyologist, and all those guys together, and then they'll beat each other up, and we'll come up with a general story.
Or do you see yourself then as a kind of translator for?
Yes.
You're there really representing the people who will come and see this exhibit on whatever.
Yeah, I'm the kid from the Bronx, so I look there and I say, I can't understand that. And there was times when I was developing forms for Bank of America and Wells Fargo and all these places, and they would come to me with all this bankese, and whereupon the party of the first part here and after called debtor and so forth. And I said, gee, I don't even know where to sign. Am I the debtor or am I the payee or whatever? So we try to make this language communicate so the average person could get in, make those forms accessible to the average person. We did the same thing with phone books down in the Pacific Bell Network. I used to design all the introductory pages to the phone book. And they used to speak in IDD and PBX and all this telephonese. And so I said, gee, I can't understand that either. Well, let's talk English here. And the same thing happens in science, because people are so into a particular niche that they can't understand why people don't understand it. And I'm the guy who keeps on raising his hand in class saying, I don't understand, teacher, say it again more clearly.
That's a real decision to make, that to not try to put yourself in the position of the expert, but to always sort of be the wide-eyed kid who doesn't have the answers, who really only has the questions.
Yeah. And we'll never have the question. I mean, the answer, the ultimate answer. Like, if I go back to science again, like, is Lucy an absolute, or any of these characters absolute? Things aren't absolute, because it's the ongoing process. It's the verb to know. Don, my co-author, is now in Ethiopia. He's not here. He's digging holes. He's looking for the person before Lucy, or the hominid before Lucy. You know, there is a quantum jump there between a hominid who stands up and has a body almost like ours and a chimpanzee. And there's undoubtedly some other characters in the middle there. But it's funny, I dealt with a phycologist. She's a wonderful character. She's explored all the depths of the ocean, and she set records of deep diving and all this in the bottom of the ocean. And she said, science is almost like flying over the Earth if you were a Martian in a spaceship, and you lowered a bucket down, and you scraped around the bottom of the ocean, or you scraped along New York City, say, and you pull up an old alley cat. You'd say, this is what life on this planet's like. And then they'd test the brain capacity of the alley cat, and they said, gee, they're not too savvy down there, too bad. It's because we just need that much research to go that much further.
Kevin O'Farrell, I want to thank you for joining us
Thanks.
on Upon Reflection. Kevin O'Farrell, his new book is Journey from the Dawn, Life with the World's First Family.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.